Hi, I'm Kayla Hathaway, partner here at Cimpatico. I'm launching our climate.edu channel to help students learn about the degree programs that are training the future leaders of the green economy. I'll be interviewing graduate program leaders about the degrees offered at their schools, how applicants can best prepare, what to expect as a student, research and internship opportunities, and long-term career prospects. I'll also be asking renowned professors and grad students for their thoughts on the types of skills undergraduates should focus on developing as they prepare for a master's or doctorate program. And now, on to today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to Climate EDU. I hope that the episodes today were to your enjoyment and intellectual stimulation. I am joined now by Hanna Morris, and she's a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's finishing her dissertation entitled Apocalyptic Authoritarianism in the United States, Power, Media, and Climate Crisis. Hanna is also the co-editor of the forthcoming volume Climate Change in Journalism, Negotiating Rifts of Time, published with Routledge. Hanna, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk a little bit more with you about my research. So thanks again.
Yeah, no problem. And is that like a bicycle in the background?
Yeah, it is. It's not mine.
I love the color.
It's pretty cool. I advised on the color, so that's my input into the bike decision making.
Well, it's a lovely color. There I go, stumbling all over my words. Anything can happen with live streaming. So I like the color, and it really highlights the background. So
good. I'm glad that I placed it there.
Awesome. So for an interesting title for your paper, Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, would you mind just giving us a little bit of a brief rundown of this paper and kind of like what it's about before we dive into the nitty-gritty of it?
Sure. So this is essentially my dissertation. So I am interested in broadly two things in my dissertation. I'm interested in deciphering and tracing cultural processes of erasure, whereby media, text, and images are used to obscure disparities of risk and to sort of entrench asymmetries of power further. And we can unpack that more, what that means later. But and essentially that motivated me to try to understand how apocalyptic representations of the climate crisis can actually serve to sort of obscure and erase the specifics of the climate crisis and who's impacted and the histories that really created disparities of risk in the first place. And then, so the second main thing that I'm looking at is counter discourses. So how can there be and how are there reactions to these sort of all-encompassing apocalyptic representations that really do link specific risks with specific policies and specific ways of moving forward that are designed in a more democratic manner. And so apocalyptic authoritarianism essentially is sort of the what counter discourses are combating and trying to make it so that there's more focus on environmental justice and more focus on really creating responses that address these fundamental disparities of risk. So that's essentially a rundown, a basic of the sort of motivation of the project and some of the main themes.
Cool. All right. So diving directly, like just full nose dive into it. All right, looking at the notes that we have here. So I guess let's go ahead and start with like, how have climate discourses and visuals changed since 2016? Because as we all know, 2016 was a big turning point in the way that we were talking about climate. A lot of activist movements and images, pop culture and everything as well, in addition to like a lot of political rollbacks, but that's for another time. But also like, what caused this shift? Like, why did it even happen?
Yeah, so 2016 was a really big year, and it was a year when there started to be really important changes in the way that Americans are perceiving the political moment and sort of a sense of urgency. And so I identify shifts happening in United States journalism around this time period where sort of a total crisis sort of landscape where there's a sense of urgency in terms of needing to really pay attention to fundamental issues that have happened since the election of 2016. And so climate crisis became a part of this. And there was a lot of discussion of how to think about climate change in different ways that really do address environmental justice in a more fundamental way. So the Green New Deal really kicked off and started these conversations more and more. And 2019 in particular was actually even more of a big year than 2016 in terms of this was when there was a spike in coverage of climate change in the United States media. That's when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, entered office, and really the Green New Deal entered a public stage more and more. And so there became more of a discussion of how to think about climate change differently. But also, interestingly, the media sort of latched onto these apocalyptic portrayals more than trying to really engage with the public's sort of interest for the first time and thinking about climate change differently and thinking about different approaches. So it was an interesting contrast that I found where there's these still similar tropes of apocalypse that keep on steering climate coverage and sort of trying to figure out why there's still this disconnect between media and public sentiments.
So it kind of sounds like the apocalyptic view is like kind of hurting the discourse.
Yeah, it is. And so apocalyptic images and discourses, I mean, just the images coming out of California right now, I mean, it looks like apocalypse.
Looks like Blade Runner.
And it's just been a fundamental part of climate media and discourse since the Cold War, which is really when climate change was picked up in the popular press for the first time. In particular, 1989 was a really big year. That's when Bill McKibben's End of Nature was published, which is the first really popular book on global warming. And actually, in the 1989 cover, it showed the blue marble image, so the Apollo 17 image of the blue marble Earth, fully illuminated, which was the first fully illuminated photo in 1972 that people saw of planet Earth. So the tiny blue marble floating in a vast expanse of darkness. So we had that image, but on fire. So yeah, so
like literal flames the background, like
and so that it's very striking because so this is one of the first popular books on climate change, and it's already from the get-go, apocalyptic environmentalism and apocalyptic discourses are used to really describe the risks and imagining the future of what climate change looks like. And so this is wrapped up in, of course, Cold War discourses of nuclear fallout and fears of nuclear apocalypse. And so really drawing upon those imaginaries that were percolating for so long in terms of the images of global nuclear apocalypse. And so climate change, though, is very different from that. And it's something that, for example, nuclear apocalypse, nuclear fallout was only ever a possibility. It was never a concrete reality. Also, it's something that only ever was, like I said, a future possibility where climate change is a present reality. And so there's still some issues with choosing apocalyptic representations because it's just distanced things even further and also obscures things. And it's easy to kind of fall into the idea that climate change is also just too large and requires sort of a one solution or no solution at all. So it doesn't lead to necessarily adjusting and addressing issues of failures of democracy, for example, and failures of having a strong democracy, rather. So I'm concerned with the sort of takeoff now, and also on the left too. It's being more and more apocalyptic discourses are being used in Green New Deal discourses, for example, which seems counterproductive because Green New Deal is really trying to show and sort of show in concrete ways how historical systems of power are producing climate change, and in that way there needs to be fundamental political and social change. And so by sort of drawing upon apocalyptic discourses, I worry if that's steering away from that and the understanding of needing to really instead show these concrete links instead of just sort of over and over again a sort of zoomed out image of the earth on fire.
So, do you think that the kind of like the global, let's see, try to face like kind of like a planetary scale, like apocalyptic representation of the climate crisis, do you think that I don't want to say like kind of blown out of proportion because I mean the climate crisis is incredibly serious. And but do you think that maybe just kind of like how the language of like, well, the world is ending, like the whole world is on fire, that this kind of language just really takes away to from actual issues that are happening on kind of like a more local scale, like you have Hurricane Laura, or you have the California fires, and or you have like Brazil with their fires, flooding in Nepal, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, the severity of climate change, the climate crisis is, you know, really concrete and severe. So it's not to say that the sort of scale, I mean, it is a large scale issue, but the issue with planetary scale is that it's sort of, for example, there's a term, the Anthropocene, that became popularized, or the Anthropocene. There's two pronunciations. I don't really know which one is best, but I go with
I wouldn't know, so.
So the Anthropocene became popularized as this idea of sort of a planetary scale, using a planetary scale to sort of guide this idea of there being a new epoch. So humans, broadly defined, have ushered in a new epoch. The Holocene epoch is over. And in that way, pinpointing also, interestingly, the Industrial Revolution as being the starting point of when things really got going to the point where humans, again, broadly defined, caused the momentum to move us into where essentially Earth is completely different and the planet's completely different now. So there's a couple issues here in terms of the planetary scale used in this way, where again, so humans, broadly defined, really obscures who is most responsible, what systems are most responsible, what political decisions are most responsible, what political decisions continue to perpetuate climate change. And also by choosing the Industrial Revolution, it overlooks even deeper structures within that. And so a lot of Indigenous scholars and post-colonial scholars point out that why not start with colonization as being this, if you're going to designate a new epoch, why not start with colonization? So it leads to an issue, again, of this sort of apocalyptic authoritarianism figure of sort of an Anthropocene scientist saying, no, the Industrial Revolution, that's when things started, and this is how we, as in a few folks in this scientific community, are going to solve this epochal problem. And so this really gets into an issue of needing to make sure that crises are defined in a way that includes a lot of people and a lot of stakeholders, so that the responses are able to address, for example, issues of colonization and unresolved persistent trauma of colonization that aren't being addressed with this Anthropocene definition, this planetary scale definition that currently is really, taking off. So that's why planetary scale is just sort of doesn't move in the direction towards fostering these really specific issues that need to be named and addressed.
And so, just going back to the title of your paper, so we like touched on the media and like just the discussion around it, and then the point of power. So, is that when you were mentioning the epoch, and if we're going to go and create a new one, then it should most likely be with colonialization? I think Conlon is colonialization. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing it right. It's like a anonymity, like anemone, like you can't.
Yeah.
So is that like what you mean, like using the word power in your title?
So yeah, power, I use that in sort of the critical cultural and post-colonial tradition of trying to understand how there are these hierarchies and structures in place that make it so that only a couple people, for example, define a huge issue like climate change, and only a couple people then develop responses. So power in that sense encompasses issues of gender, race. It encompasses issues of temporality in terms of trying to understand histories and trying to incorporate histories of colonization, histories of capitalism within understanding why there are certain definitions and responses that are persistently leveraged and put forward. So power in that way is sort of used as a way of really trying to understand dynamics that steer the direction of really how societal decision making is done and how governance is done. So that's also why apocalyptic authoritarianism, I sort of, um, thought that that was descriptive in terms of trying to show the potential downfall of responses to apocalyptic environmentalism. So the power of just a few sort of defining what apocalyptic environmentalism is, and then the response to it. And so this sort of definition and response relationship.
Got it, got it. Thank you for clarifying that one for me. And I have a comment slash question from Lee in the chat. Um, she's saying, like, I'm wondering about the kind of dark humor of social media meme sharing and tweeting has in a place of discourse. Like, example, on Twitter, I think it's become a way of coping with climate anxiety, COVID, etc., to make comments using the term apocalypse. But it's also a way of venting and sharing the feels amongst people who care and are going through it as well. What do you think?
Yeah, that's the thing. Apocalypse has been used historically, actually, among groups who feel disempowered. So it's not necessarily like apocalypse will lead to apocalyptic authoritarianism, or it's used in a way where people aren't reflecting on what the potential consequences of an all-encompassing definition would lead to. But the issue, though, and there's a really good book that I recommend called Catastrophism, and it was, I think, published in 2012, and it has a bunch of co-authors, and they are folks on the left who sort of warn against the idea of collapsology, catastrophism, apocalyptic environmentalism, because it sort of contributes actually to the right's political project of othering and of separating, because where there is apocalypse, there tends to be the idea of a visionary sage figure that sort of chooses what either the post-apocalyptic scenario is going to look like, or what a utopia out of apocalypse would look like. And it can be exclusionary of who is a part of this vision and who's left out. And so again, apocalyptic discourses have been around since biblical times. It's something that has been used to unite people, but also to separate people. And so there's some risks in using apocalypse in that way. And it can also lead to, you mentioned before, sort of apathy. And there's this term called edgelords, where sort of the idea like, oh, like apocalypse, if that's going to happen, then what should we do? Like, and sort of kind of raising yourself above needing to have political change, because you just think that, nothing's going to happen, nothing's going to change, it's inevitable, that things are only going to get worse.
You're like full doomer mode, like, well, it doesn't matter, so I'm just gonna keep doing what I'm doing, and it's like, no, but we can actually still address these problems.
Yeah, also it takes away from the fact that people are addressing these problems. There's been robust environmental justice organizations and environmental justice politics that have been doing really incredible work for so long, and these politics have been happening, and there's changes that have been happening. So yeah, it's more of how can media and how can discourse be used to sort of draw attention to those histories instead of, distracting potentially from them.
So, overall, like, what would be? Because I mean, I know it's not published yet, so I'm not sure if you're like allowed to like just go and be like, well, this is the conclusion or anything like that. But like, um, I'll just ask, like, so like, what is the conclusion that from your research that's like the big takeaway that you would like to pass along to everyone?
So my takeaway is trying to think about media as a tool for political change instead of a tool for sensationalism or erasure. So trying to think about how media can create visibility and accountability and political change. And that way, needing to, like I said, pay attention to how media is used differently outside the mainstream, for example, and looking to see how folks who are campaigning for the Green New Deal, folks who are campaigning for decolonization, folks who are campaigning for democratizing universities and democratizing knowledge, how are these groups using media, and how can that be a model instead of sort of using the same tropes that have been around since the Cold War era to sort of represent climate change. So how can we learn from really how media is being used as a tool for change instead of a tool for apocalyptic fear mongering? That would be a main takeaway.
So instead of like, was it like the Green New Deal is socialist propaganda and fun stuff
Yeah,
like that.
that's another thing. Yeah, it's such a uniquely like United States phenomenon about how socialism is seen as being some sort of crazy, like anti-American, like terrible thing. And that's
Yeah.
actually like in my dissertation, I traced the connection between that and apocalyptic discourses
Hey.
too.
Yeah.
So I got that covered. All right.
Cool. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to reading that. Like that's something that I've always just found fascinating, where it's like capitalism, socialism, and communism are just forms of economy and not forms of like governance. But then you have was like authoritarianism, fascism, libertarian, or I forget what the term is for like the more like left political, like do you have democracy, like democratic and stuff? And it's like they can all be interchanged. Like you can have democratic socialist or like democratic capitalist, and you can have anyway. I've always just found that funny.
Also like socialism, like what, like if it's democratic socialism, like what's the problem? It's
Yeah.
about including people in decisions, it's about having equity and about having justice. Like what is, like what, I mean, so the Cold War, I mean, there's all these histories of creating, the United States as against the Soviet Union, and that we demonize anything that's seen as socialist. And so it's just these deep histories that are just surprisingly so difficult to overcome. We're sort of seeing that playing out now with our politics and just these sort of, how to move beyond that deep American exceptionalism and that being equated with capitalism, how different ways of thinking about what being American and what United States governance and economy looks like.
Mhm.
Green New Deal is doing a really interesting thing, but there's been so much pushback in US media. That's actually a paper that I just wrote that shows the pushback against the Green New Deal and sort of demonizing it and saying that, we're already in an unstable political landscape. The Green New Deal is only going to make it worse. And in that way, equating Green New Deal folks with Trump and Tea Party members.
Oh,
So these crazy sort of
geez. Like,
somersaults are made to just sort of create this idea of extremism. And in that way, just sort of closing off the conversation and not imagining other ways of, organizing politics, which is really scary. And that's, authoritarianism.
oh yeah, I mean, I in lost count of how many times I've been called like a crazy commie for saying like, hey, maybe people should all have access to clean drinking water. Maybe.
It's crazy. It's still, it's, yeah, it's just such an odd part of United States culture.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, the moment it gets published, please email me because I would love to go and read through it. And for your article, I'll go ahead and poke Mike and be like, hey, like have Hannah on if you'd be interested to come back on and just talk about like your like media publications. I think that'd be really cool.
Yeah, I would love to.
Cool.
That would be great.
Sweet. Well, thank you. Well, the time just blew by, and thank you so much for coming on. I'm gonna roll the end credits, and we're gonna roll into just chatting to answer a couple last minute questions and comments. Just one moment.